Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Nuremberg, to the former Nazi Party Rally grounds. My name is Johannes Pechstein and I'm your tour guide today around these grounds. I will show you what these grounds were, what the meaning of these grounds was, and how the Nazis used it for their annual party rallies, for their show events and propaganda events here. But before we can go on these grounds and show you around the place a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit about the context of it. We have to keep in mind that in 1933, on 30th January 1933, a man by the name Adolf Hitler was appointed as Reichschancellor by then Reichspresident Paul von Hindenburg. And that's how the whole thing started. And one of the first things that the Nazis decided immediately after that was that they wanted to have annual party rallies in one particular city in Germany in a special place which they wanted to design only for that purpose. And they came here to Nuremberg for that, for a bunch of reasons. There was a vast empty area in the southeast of the city which they could use for those big buildings, the stadiums and everything else. Transportation to Nuremberg was quite excellent because Nuremberg has excellent railway connections to all over Germany. If you count in Austria, which in 1933 wasn't a part of Germany, but then in 1938 became a part of Germany, if you count that in, Nuremberg also is in a relatively central position. So the reasons why the Nazis picked Nuremberg were of a more practical nature. But that's not what they said in their propaganda. In their propaganda they said, we picked Nuremberg because of its history. The Nazis always wanted to give themselves some sort of, historical connection to Germany's past. And that's how they wanted to relate to the Holy Roman Empire. They wanted to say, see, we are here in the same city where the kings and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire had their first imperial diets. But of course that was complete nonsense. They actually picked the place for completely different reasons. And they came here in 1933 and they started with this particular place where we are at the moment and started to turn this into a big arena. They used the memorial that you can see behind me over there, which was a memorial for the fallen of the First World War, which the city of Nuremberg had built here already in the 1920s. They used this and then they built stages and tribunes around the whole grandstands, around the whole place. You can see here, this was a park before the Nazis came here. You can see people walking around, people riding their bikes. And that's pretty much the same thing that it was before the Nazis came here. And they flattened this area here and built up grandstands around the whole place and turned this into a huge arena. And already in September 1933, they held their first rallies here with up to 200,000 people. And that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted to have big events here, big show events, where they could show that the whole mass of the German people was standing behind Hitler and behind his ideas, and that everybody was equal. If you look at the people on the plane there, the participants of the SA and the SS, for example, in this particular picture, then you can see that they look all equal and everybody is the same. Nobody is standing out except Hitler. For him, there were always special stages built, special places where he could be in an elevated position, so he looks as if he was reigning, ruling the whole thing from above, leading from above. Everybody else equal. What the Nazis, of course, didn't show was that the visitors around the place, on the grandstands, they were actually, not so equal. It was actually quite expensive to be a visitor, just a spectator here. They had to buy tickets and those were quite expensive. And so the people on the stands around it, they were actually quite rich usually, and some people poorer people, and you could see that on their clothes, but that was not what came in the official pictures, in the official photos and the press work for these party events. What you could see around the globe in the films and on the photos was an equal mass of people, the grey mass, so to speak, and only Hitler standing out of it. And that's what they used this place for. And remember, they took power in January, but in September they already had these huge events here on the so-called Luitpoldhain here in Nuremberg. And that was the whole goal, to have huge events. We are still in the Luitpold Park here, and Luitpold, by the way, was a Bavarian prince regent who ruled Bavaria up until 1912, and he was very popular, and that's the reason why so many things here were named after him. The park was named Luitpold Park. But that was not the only thing here. There was, if you look over there, these stairs were leading up to a hall from 1906 on. And that year, that hall was built in a typical Art Nouveau style of that period. It was a machine hall for a state exhibition, and it still stood there in 1933 when the Nazis came here. And so the Nazis decided to use this hall for some of their sessions, especially for the party Congress. And that's why they also renamed it the Congresshall, or the Old Congresshall, but the actual name known in the population here was Luitpoldhain. And the hall was still there, but it had two major problems. The first problem was the look of the hall. It was typical Art Nouveau style, and Adolf Hitler hated that. It was far too friendly, far too nice, far too many ornaments, far too many colors. Absolutely not what he intended for the buildings here on these grounds. And so he gave his favorite architect at the time, Albert Speer, he gave him the task to give this hall that was up there a different look. And Albert Speer, we will hear a lot more about him on these grounds, he just put a big wall in front of the hall, like a theatre scene, so to speak, and that made the hall look very, very different. And on the picture you can see that there are no ornaments, there are only very few colors, only the red flags and just stone. It's not an open glass facade like with the old hall, with the old Art Nouveau hall. So very, very different, but very typical for the style that Adolf Hitler wanted to have here. We call that kind of architecture, we call that the architecture of intimidation. It's not an architectural style, they used a variety of styles. It just means everything had to be big, it had to be massive, it had to be really heavy and, you know, represent power and strength. And that's what Albert Speer did with this hall by putting in front of it just a big wall to make it look different. So that was the solution to the first problem. But the second problem was quite more difficult. It was the size of the whole building. Into that building you could get somewhat about 15,000 to 16,000 people, which was by far not what Hitler wanted to have here. He wanted to have big masses, not just 15,000, 16,000. Like here in the park, 200,000 people. That was far more to his taste. So what they needed was a bigger hall, and the new Congress Hall was built right over there on the other side of the road, and we are going to have a look at that in a moment. What you can see behind me here, this is the new Congress Hall, the Congress Hall, as the Nazis later called it. And it's a huge place. It was intended to hold 50,000 seats, and it's very typical for the architecture of intimidation, as we as historians call it. An architecture meant to intimidate people, to really impress people and be really massive. You can see massive stone facade here, and it's granite from the outside, so a massive material. And that's what Hitler wanted to have here. It's not just typical for the Nazis, many other dictatorships in history did that, but here it's especially huge and very intimidating and intense. And so this is the impression that you get from the outside, but let's go inside and have a look at that from there, and it's even more intense. Okay, we're now here inside what was to become the Congress Hall. what was to become the Congresshall. As you can see, it was never finished. It's actually not a hall. It's just a rudimentary building, actually, which was never really finished. All the floors and all the walls should have been covered with white marble. The whole building should have held 50,000 seats, and everything was designed only to set Hitler into the right spot, to put him into scene. The roof up there would have had a big window, and the whole building is built in an east-west direction. So on a special time in the afternoon, the sun would shine through that window directly on that spot over there, and that was the spot where Hitler would have his elevated position, so that everyone even close to him would have had to look up towards him, and so that he would appear a bit taller than he actually was. And that would have been the time also where he would give his speech in the afternoon, and so he would appear in some sort of divine light, in divine sunlight. But as you can see, it never came to that. Nothing ever happened here. There was never any session. For all of their Nazi Party rallies, Nazis had some sort of a theme or a motto. The first one, 1933, was called Nazi Party Rally of Victory, because in that year they took power in Germany. The last one that they actually did in 1938 was called the Nazi Party Rally of Greater Germany, because in that year Austria became a part of Germany, and the Czech Republic later in November became a part of Germany as well. And the last one that they actually still planned for September 1939, they called that one the Nazi Party Rally of Peace. But that one was cancelled on 26th of August 1939, and on 1st of September the Nazis attacked Poland, and by that started World War II. After that, all the work here ended. All the workers had to take up arms and go to war. And so that's why this place is still in this condition. And what you can see here is roughly the state of construction in 1939. The problem here was that after World War II, the people here in Nuremberg said, okay, let's get rid of it. Let's tear everything down that reminds us of the Nazi period and get rid of it and let literally green grass grow over it. But even that was far too expensive. To tear this down would have cost millions and millions of Deutschmark, and nobody had the money at the time, and all the money they had, they needed to rebuild the city. So that's literally the only reason that this building is still standing, and still today it's quite difficult how to handle it. This horseshoe-shaped round building, which is round about 40 meters high, had it ever been finished, the building would have been about 70 meters high, so almost twice as what it is today. This horseshoe-shaped building is partly used for storage, and then there's a northern building, which is nowadays used for the documentation center, Nazi Party Rally grounds, and the so-called southern head building, that is used nowadays ever since 1962 by the Nuremberg Symphonic Orchestra. They have a concert hall in there, they have rehearsal rooms and things like that. We are here now in the hallway with these arcades. The hallway spans around the whole building, around the whole Congress Hall. And if you look over there, you can see that it seems to go on forever. And that was one of the effects that Nazis wanted to achieve here, a huge impression being made on people. And not only this, but also the doors, the entrance doors, where the visitors would have come in, doors like this one here. They were bricked up after World War II and closed, but this was actually supposed to be an entrance door for the visitors who come in here and take part in these sessions. And you can see that they are huge. And if you come here and into this hall as a single person, then you first feel very intimidated by this architecture, by this magnitude here. You feel insignificant as a single person, and you feel really small. But then you go inside there. You sit there with 50,000 other people who wear the same clothes, who sing the same songs, who worship the same people. And in that community of the people, in that Volksgemeinschaft, as the Nazis called it, you should feel strong again, and you should feel carried again. And That was one of the intentions, one of many intentions that Nazis connected with these buildings. The huge, massive architecture that makes you feel small, but then the community to which you belong that makes you feel strong again. And that was one of the purposes behind this building. And you can see that here in this hallway and with these entrance doors very, very well. We left the Congresshall and we came here to the so-called Grade Road. This road was meant for troop parades only and for absolutely nothing else. It's a road which is about 40 meters wide here in this spot over there. A bit further down the road it's about 60 meters wide, and it was supposed to be about 2 kilometers long, but it never came to that because only 1.5 kilometers could be finished before World War II started. And Albert Speer, you remember the architect who designed many of the things here, he designed this road as well. And what he did was he thought, how can I help the soldiers to perform really great and fantastic and perfect parades? And so he put a few aids into this whole thing, including, it starts with the stones that he used here. These are, again, granite stones, and they are exactly 1.20 meters to 1.20 meters square stones. And these 1.20 meter mean they are exactly the size of 2 Prussian goose steps, like this. And so that was one of the things that he built in to help the soldiers perform perfect parades. And if you look down the road, then you can see that the stones have a different color. There are darker stones and there are lighter stones. And they built some sort of a chessboard. That also to help the soldiers go in a straight line all the 2 kilometers from the one end of the road to the other end in one straight line without making any curves or waves or anything like that. But it never came to that. No parade ever took place here. Again, as I said, it was never finished. Construction work had to stop after 1st of September 1939. And so all that's left here is this huge parking lot, which is used for the big events here in Nuremberg, for the football games, for the Volksfest, the beer festival here, and a few other things. And there's a big fair center down the road. They also use this as their parking lot. But one of the buildings beside the road is the so-called German Stadium. And let's go there and have a look what happened there and what's left of that. The place here looks quite idyllic, doesn't it? It's a nice lake, the sun is shining, it's spring, birds everywhere. But beware, you shouldn't go into that water because it's completely poisoned. And the signs here remind you of that. And the reason for that is it's actually not just a lake. It's what's left of the construction pit of the so-called German Stadium. A huge stadium that was planned here and designed by Albert Speer, but which was never finished. They didn't get far, they didn't get past the construction pit period because World War II started on the 1st of September 1939, and so they had to stop construction work here. After the war, the pit was still there, and the city decided to dump rubble from the city center, which was bombed very heavily, from the industrial area, which was bombed very heavily. And they decided to dump the rubble here, and this hill over there developed. That's all the rubble from the city center and from the industrial area. And at the time, they didn't care too much about what they dumped there, so they took everything, all the chemicals that were there, all the oils, all sorts of things that they found there, and just dumped it there. The rainwater washed the poison out into this northern part of the pit and into this lake, and that's why it's poisoned, completely poisoned nowadays. The German Stadium was designed to hold 405,000 seats, designed by Albert Speer, and the side walls should have been 120 meters high. I earlier spoke about the Congresshall, which is about 40 meters high. Now imagine that thing 3 times the height, and then you are at what the German Stadium should have been. It had some design flaws, I have to admit, because the people in the upper ranks, in the highest ranks, would have sat about 100 meters above the field, so they couldn't have seen anything anyway. But that was the idea, a huge stadium here on this place, but it was never finished. All that's left is a poisoned lake. The stadium that you can see behind me is the so-called Max Morlock Stadium, as it is today. It was built as the Municipal Stadium in the 1920s by the city, and it was used from 1933 on by the Nazis for the Nazi Party Rallies. And in this particular case, this place was used for the meetings of the Hitler Youth. Up to 60,000 Hitler Youth gathered in there, same as with the adults. Hitler was giving a speech, masses of people filled the stadium, and that was the special event for the young people, for the Hitler Youth people. It happened in the stadium, not built by Hitler, but used by him. Nowadays, it's just the city football stadium. Okay, we're now here on the so-called Zeppelin Field, one of those mass parade grounds that Nazis built here. And the first question I have to answer, of course, is why Zeppelin Field? What does this place here have to do with the Zeppelin? Well, it's quite simple. Before the Nazis came here, this place was a huge flat meadow. There was nothing here. No buildings, not even trees, just a few sheep grazing on these meadows, and that was it. Absolutely nothing else. But in 1909, Count Zeppelin, the man who invented these aircrafts, he landed here once, and that was something huge and something spectacular. The news about this spread very quickly into the city. People came out from the city to see it. After a few hours, he flew away again, people went home again, but after that, it was called the Zeppelin Meadow. And that's where the name comes from, and the Nazis decided to keep that name because Zeppelin was a symbol for German industrialization. Then when Albert Speer came here in the early 1930s, he saw this huge flat meadow and he said, this is the perfect place to build a huge mass parade ground on. And he first designed these spectator stands that go around the whole field. On these stands, most of it nowadays is overgrown with grass, but at the time you could hold up to 70,000, 80,000 people on these stands, visitors, spectators. The participants gathered here on the so-called Zeppelin Field, on the actual field, which could hold another 170 to 180,000 people. So that round about 250,000 people. And then finally, the most important place here is the so-called Zeppelin Grandstand, which could hold in total another round about 20,000 people. And you can see these stairs and the center part of it with these different levels, and right in the middle you can see the place where Hitler stood and gave his speeches. Hitler always in that elevated position, always in the center there, and the closer you were to Hitler in the center position, the higher you were in the ranks of the Nazis. And up there on the highest level, only the top Nazi leaders, government members, top military personnel, the top generals were up there, and the whole architecture was modeled after a Greek altar, the so-called Pergamon altar. You can still see the original in a museum in Berlin. And Albert Speer was given the task of building an altar for Hitler. And that's why he came up with the idea of looking at this Pergamon altar, which was from the Greek city of Pergamon in nowadays Turkey. And there they also had these stairs, and he modeled this place here roughly after that Pergamon altar. And what he did was to give this building an ancient feeling, an ancient mood. He used limestone here, but the problem with limestone is it's not very tough stone, unlike the granite and concrete in the Congresshall and the bricks in the Congresshall. Limestone falls apart quite easily, and this building was built very, very quickly. The construction work took only a few years. It was finished in 1937, But you can see that there are already a lot of damages up there, and one part is missing. The arcades on the top of that are missing. They also fell apart after the war very quickly, and that is the reason why this is in a really bad shape and has to be renovated over the next years. But let's have a look from the top, from up there on the field, and talk more about that. Before we go upstairs and have a look from the top on the Zeppelin Field, we come here into this place, which is the so-called Golden Hall. It was meant to be the entrance hall where people came in and then walked up these stairs up to the top of the grandstand and had a look from up there on the field and on what was happening there. And they came, that was the idea, they came through these entrance doors over here, huge doors, roughly as big as the doors that were meant to be in the Congresshall. And then they came in here, and on the opposite side of these doors are these vaults, which were probably meant to hold statues of fallen Nazi heroes. You already hear, I say probably, maybe, things like that. We don't know a lot about what this place was actually meant to be. It has the feel of a church, of a religious building. You can hear the sound, the reverb here in this building. It's quite huge and probably meant as some sort of sacred entrance into the whole place for the people who came here to reflect. And the whole place, the whole Nazi Party rally grounds were in general meant to be more of a sort of religious place, religious gathering point for the whole Nazi movement. We can have a look at the top here, and you can all see two things if you look up there. You can see on the one hand why this is called the Golden Hall, because of this golden mosaic. It's actually real gold, and it's still original from the 1930s. And the other thing that you can see up there is why this is not open to the public. In Germany nowadays, it's illegal to show swastikas in public, and in the mosaic there are swastikas, and so that's the reason why this is not publicly accessible. And one thing that we keep in here is this fireball. Used to be on the top of one of these, one of the side pylons of the grandstand, and now it's stored in here. The second is still exists. It's outside of this place, and these were the fireballs where the fire was lit during a night session that the Nazis held, and for a pure light effect. We are now at the top of the grandstand, of the Zeppelin grandstand, and from here we have a nice view over the whole area, over the whole field, down there where the troops paraded, where the participants gathered, and where most of the sessions, of the content of the sessions was held. And from here you can see this huge field, and they had all sorts of different kinds of sessions down there. The meetings or the sessions were held on different days in that week of Nazi Party rallies. It was usually a week, and during that week they had a day of the National Labor Service, a day of the Wehrmacht, of the regular army at the time, all sorts of days. But there was one very special moment, and that was the so-called Day of the Political Leaders. During that day, there were all sorts of sessions here, but at night, in the dark, they had a very special thing here. They had people coming on the field, political leaders, so low-level Nazi leaders from villages, from towns, and they came down here and they had torches in their hands, and in the dark, that was already quite an interesting, quite a very captivating light effect, so to speak. Then on the two side pylons of this building, there were big fireballs where they lit fires in the dark, and in the center, the huge golden swastika, which was on the top of the building, was lighted as well. So that already was quite an interesting light effect and quite impressive. But then Albert Speer had another idea. He said, you know what? Let's put 130 anti-aircraft searchlights, you know, those searchlights from period films probably, where they search the sky for enemy planes. Let's put those around the whole compound and let them light straight up into the sky. And when you stood here on this grandstand or on the field, it felt as if huge pillars were going up on the side of this. And as if you were standing in a huge hall or a huge cathedral or something like that. And Albert Speer called it the Cathedral of Light. So that was also something very, very special. And something very impressive and a big show, always just to put Hitler into the right spotlight. If you look around this here, you can see these towers that hold the spectator stands. They look like fortress towers. And that was the look that they wanted to have. But their use is very, very different. You know, if you gather here 250,000 or more people, somebody has to pee. So these buildings were used as toilets. That was the purpose of the fortress towers, so to speak. And then let's have a look at the so-called Führerkanzel, the place where Hitler stood, and see what he saw from up there. We're now here at the so-called Führerkanzel, the place where Hitler held his speeches and where people could see him from all sides. And please come with me to see what he saw from up there. So again, an elevated position, so that even the people who sat behind him had to look up to him. And then he had this view from up here on up to 250,000 people. Of course, there weren't any trees down there, and there weren't any fences. Much has changed ever since. But the buildings are still here. They remind us of that time, of that period in German history, which was very dark and where Nuremberg was used as the stage for Hitler to present himself as the redeemer and as the savior of Germany. And that was the sole purpose, pure propaganda, and absolutely nothing else. So thank you for coming with me on this short tour. I hope you liked it, and maybe see you next time in Nuremberg. Bye-bye.